The sound was not the clean slice you imagine. It was a dull, horrible cutting as the 9.5-inch blade was drawn across the abdomen. The smell of arterial blood, heavy and sweet, filled the temple courtyard as the man's own intestines began to protrude from the wound. Every horrifying detail was observed and recorded by an official witness, a British diplomat whose private journals were never meant for widespread publication. This was seppuku ritual suicide, but was it truly an act of honor? Or was it a coerced execution disguised as a noble choice? What was the grim, clinical purpose of the final beheading? A strike designed specifically not to sever the head completely. The answers lie beyond the sanitized stories of Bushidō, hidden in forensic reports that reveal a system of calculated brutality. Continue watching to see the evidence that proves the reality was far worse than the legend. We'll show you the measurements, the sounds, and the smells, and expose a method of execution so psychologically twisted it was designed to last for days, requiring the public's direct participation. That was the sound of a ritual private, precise, and shrouded in a twisted sort of honor. But not all punishments under the samurai code were so intimate, so contained. Some were designed for the masses, a brutal form of public programming. They weren't whispered about in temples. They were screamed from across. They were designed to be seen from a distance and smelled. Imagine walking a dusty road outside a provincial town. Long before you see it, the smell finds you an unbearable miasma of sweet rot and human waste, a scent so foul and pervasive it's said to cling to the back of your throat from 200 paces away. And then you see it, high on a mound of earth, silhouetted against the sky. For 3 days, by explicit legal decree, the body must remain. It hangs there, limp, secured to a wooden cross, not with nails, but with coarse hemp ropes tied so tight they've bitten deep into the swollen, discolored flesh of the wrists and ankles. Scavenger birds, emboldened by the stillness, have already done their work. They've taken the eyes, the lips, the soft tissues of the face, leaving a hollowed-out parody of a human gaze that stares out blindly over a populace forced to bear witness to this monument of decay. The skin, exposed to the relentless cycle of sun and dew, has turned a mottled black and green, stretched taut like a drum over a torso bloated with the gases of decomposition. This wasn't a battlefield casualty. This was a message, meticulously crafted and brutally delivered. Before you can even begin to learn how this man died, you must first understand why he was left here like this, made into a public spectacle of putrescence. And the answer, we've discovered, is not justice. It is theater, a carefully staged performance of absolute power, and we have found the records that prove it. The official histories of the shogunate speak of honor and discipline, of a society in perfect balance. But tucked away in the ledgers of provincial governors and the private diaries of European traders are the stage directions for this horror show. They detail the exact number of days a body must be displayed. They describe the preferred locations, intersections, riverbanks, town entrances for maximum public visibility. This was never about punishing one man. It was about psychologically dominating an entire society, holding them captive with a stench and a sight they could never, ever forget. To comprehend this theater of cruelty, we must first examine the beautiful lie it was built to defend. The noble, gilded world of the samurai and the pristine code they claimed to live by. And what a beautiful lie it was. A world painted in delicate ink-wash strokes on silk scrolls. A world of serene rock gardens where the silence is broken only by the rustle of silk, of perfectly composed poetry written in the moments before a battle, of warriors whose gleaming armor was as much a work of art as a tool of war. This is the image that has been sold to the world for centuries. The gilded cage of Bushidō, the way of the warrior. It's a philosophy built on 7 sublime pillars, each a noble aspiration meant to elevate a soldier into something more. Gi justice, the unwavering moral compass. Yu heroic courage, in the face of all odds. Jin benevolence, the compassion for your fellow man. They wrote these words with masterful calligraphy, the brush strokes flowing with a grace that masked the iron will behind them. Respect, Makoto honesty, Meiyo honor, the core of one's identity, and above all, Chugi unquestioning loyalty. This is the samurai code as it was written. A philosophy for a class of elite warriors, a moral framework in a world of chaos, but it's a carefully crafted illusion, a masterpiece of propaganda designed to conceal a brutal system of absolute control. Think about it. For centuries, this was a military dictatorship. To maintain their grip on power, the samurai class needed the population, and even themselves, to believe in their inherent moral superiority. Bushidō was the ultimate justification. It transformed ruthless warlords into enlightened philosopher-kings. It turned unquestioning obedience into the highest virtue and dissent into a stain upon the soul. So what happens when a warrior fails? What happens when someone steps outside the gilded cage? The official histories tell one story, a tale of honorable men choosing a dignified, stoic end. But hidden diaries and recently discovered forensic evidence tell another story entirely, one that doesn't speak of honor, but of fear. Not of choice, but of brutal compulsion. This code wasn't just an ideal to strive for, it was a weapon to be wielded. Every single one of those virtues had a dark reflection, a terrifying, physical consequence for failure. And as we will soon see, the punishments were not about justice. They were about maintaining the illusion. They were designed to be so horrifying, so psychologically scarring, that no one would ever dare to question the beautiful lie. This philosophy wasn't just captured in art, it was codified into law, and the penalties for violating it. They were written in blood, and written in blood it was. But this was never random violence. It was organized, meticulous, and above all, it was legal. To understand the cold logic behind the horrors to come, you have to understand the world that forged them, a world Japan's new rulers would do anything to prevent from returning. For over a century, the country was engulfed in the fires of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. Imagine a landscape of constant, near total war, where there is no safety, no stability, no future. Ambitious daimyo, feudal lords, carved up the nation, their territories shifting like sand dunes in a storm. Alliances were made over sake in the morning and broken with a knife in the back by evening. Betrayal was a common currency, and assassination a routine tool of politics. Life was cheap. After generations of this bloodshed, the Tokugawa shogunate finally unified the country, and their primary obsession was ensuring that this chaos could never, ever return. They engineered a peace built on a foundation of fear. They locked down the nation, imposing a rigid four-tier class system from which there was no escape and severely restricting travel. The Edo period was peaceful, but it was the fragile peace of a prison yard, maintained by the constant, looming threat of unimaginable violence. To control a nation forged in constant warfare, the shogunate needed more than laws. They needed terror, codified and ritualized. They needed a system where the punishment itself was a message carved into the flesh and minds of the populace. This is that system's blueprint. It's called the Kujikata Osadamegaki, the official legal code of the Edo shogunate, established in 1742. It is not a philosophical text. It is a practical manual for state-sponsored terror. Inside its pages, the punishments we will investigate are not described as acts of passion or rage, but are laid out in sterile, bureaucratic detail. Crucifixion, death by boiling, even a horrifying method of execution by sawing are all officially sanctioned, legally prescribed methods of control. This document is the missing link, the proof that the horrors were not an aberration but a deliberate and essential part of the power structure. This was the architecture of fear. And within this architecture, the shogunate designed its masterpiece of psychological control, a punishment that the ruling class, the samurai themselves, would be forced to inflict upon their own bodies. It is the most famous, most mythologized ritual of all, and it begins with a single 9.5-inch blade. That single blade is the key to the most potent myth in the samurai legend. You've seen it in films and read about it in books. The act is known as seppuku, though it is sometimes called by the cruder term harakiri. Of all the samurai practices, none is more famous or more misunderstood. It is presented as the ultimate honorable act, a way to atone for failure, protest injustice, or prove one's sincerity beyond all doubt. A tranquil, dignified exit. Imagine the scene. A serene temple garden or a quiet, tatami-matted room. The condemned samurai has ritually bathed and is dressed in a shi ni shozoku, the pure white robes of death. He kneels perfectly, in the formal seiza position, before a low wooden stand. On it rests a tray holding the instrument, a short sword, a wakizashi or tanto, its blade meticulously polished. The hilt is wrapped in clean white paper, leaving only the razor-sharp tip exposed. Before him, an attendant offers an inkstone and brush. With a steady hand, he composes his jisei, his death poem, a final, elegant expression of his acceptance of fate. There is no fear, only a profound and transcendent calm. Standing behind him, poised and silent, is his kaishakunin, his second, often a trusted friend or a master swordsman, his own katana drawn and ready. When the poem is finished, the samurai opens his robes, takes the blade, and with a single, unwavering motion, makes the cut into his own abdomen. No sound escapes his lips. It is a testament to his complete mastery over pain, over the weakness of the flesh. In that moment, before agony can compromise his dignity, the kaishakunin's sword flashes down in a single, perfect arc. The blow is an act of mercy, severing the neck, but in the most skilled hands, leaving a small flap of skin so the head lolls forward as if in a final bow, preserving a final shred of decorum. It's a beautiful, powerful image, a testament to the samurai spirit. But it is a performance, and we've discovered the stage notes, the eyewitness accounts they didn't want you to see, that are filled with the clinical, horrifying details of what happens when the blade isn't sharp enough, when the will isn't strong enough, and when the merciful blow of the second is anything but. The 9.5-inch truth is far more brutal than the art. It starts with a bamboo saw. You might think that crucifixion, a public spectacle of prolonged agony, is the absolute worst it could get. But newly analyzed legal codes, specifically the Kujikata Osadamegaki, confirm a punishment so psychologically vile it seems impossible. A method so cruel it's often dismissed as a boogeyman's tale. It was called nokogirizuri, the saw-pulling death. The scene, as described in legal texts and illustrated in horrific woodblock prints, is one of absolute helplessness. The victim was buried in the earth, packed in tight up to their neck, their head sometimes secured in a wooden stock to prevent any movement. They were alive, conscious, and utterly trapped. Placed beside them, for all to see, was the instrument of their death. Not a sharp steel headsman's sword, but a simple bamboo saw. And this detail is critical. A bamboo saw's serrated edge is fibrous and rough. It doesn't cut cleanly. It shreds. It tears at flesh, snags on sinew, and grates against bone, inflicting thousands of agonizing, shallow wounds with every pull. But the true, unthinkable horror of nokogirizuri wasn't the burial, and it wasn't the saw. It was the chilling lack of an official executioner. Instead, a sign was posted, an invitation, an encouragement for ordinary people, farmers, merchants, even other samurai passing by to take a turn, to pick up the saw and pull it across the victim's neck. One pull, two pulls, each person contributing just a small part to an agonizingly slow death that could take days. This wasn't just an execution. It was a ritual of collective, forced corruption. It turned an entire community into accomplices. Can you imagine the psychology at play? The pressure to prove your own loyalty by participating in the condemnation of another. It was a diabolical form of social engineering, blurring the line between justice and atrocity, making everyone complicit in the state's terror. For the victim of the saw, death, when it finally came after days of torment, must have been a release. But for many enemies of the state, the final breath was not the end of their punishment. In fact, for the warrior class, the obsession with honor and shame meant the body itself became the final battlefield. The state wasn't finished with you just because you were dead. The state wasn't finished with you just because you were dead. For the warrior class, the obsession with honor, shame, and status meant the body itself became the final battlefield. The practice of taking the heads of defeated enemies is infamous, a well-known part of samurai lore. But the romanticized image of a warrior respectfully claiming a worthy opponent's head is, like everything else, a carefully constructed lie. For centuries, the truth was buried, but it's only through a 1982 forensic excavation of a mass grave near the battlefield of Sekigahara that we know the truly horrifying bureaucratic details. Forensic osteologists examining the remains found exactly what they expected. Skulls with the telltale sharp force trauma at the base of the neck, consistent with decapitation. But they also found something else, something much more disturbing. Small, precisely drilled holes in the skulls. For what purpose? The chilling conclusion is inescapable. They were for mounting them on stands, for display. In some cases, they even found small clay identification tags pressed into the opening at the base of the skull. This wasn't just battlefield savagery. This was an organized, clerical process of turning a human body into a trophy. And the preparation for this display was a gruesome industry in itself. Before being presented to a victorious daimyo in a ceremony called kubi-jiki, the heads were often boiled to remove flesh and then salted for preservation. We even have records from one minor clan describing the aftermath. An unbearable stench of brine and decay that clung to the castle walls for weeks. This process reveals a grim truth. Heads became a form of battlefield currency. A samurai's worth and his reward were measured by the number and rank of the heads he could present. This created a macabre incentive to mutilate the dead for personal gain. An act that stands in stark, ugly contrast to the noble virtues of Bushidō. From the convulsive gasps of a botched ritual suicide to the public complicity of the saw, and now to heads boiled and mounted like hunting trophies, every piece of evidence directly contradicts the noble lie. The official history is pristine, but the forensic record is soaked in blood. It is time to place these two narratives side by side and confront the full, horrifying truth of the samurai code. The official history is pristine, but the forensic record is soaked in blood. It is time to place these two narratives side by side and confront the full, horrifying truth of the samurai code. On one side, we have the official chronicles, the carefully curated histories written by the ruling class. They present a world of honor and stoicism, of warriors who faced death with a calm dignity. This is the narrative of control, of Bushidō as a noble philosophy. On the other side, we have the hidden records. As we watch the clean, official scroll burn away, a different story is revealed beneath it. One written in a shakier hand, one stained with blood and grime. The official story of seppuku is of a silent, honorable death. But the private journal of a foreign diplomat tells us of the dull, horrible cutting sound and the convulsive gasps that continued even after beheading. The official legal codes list haritsuke, crucifixion, as a standard punishment for the worst criminals. But the diary of a traveling merchant, a man who had the misfortune of passing by an execution ground, describes the unbearable miasma of sweet rot and excrement and the chilling sight of a body left to bloat for 3 days by law. The official histories depict glorious battles and heroic warriors, but the bones themselves, unearthed centuries later from a mass grave at Sekigahara, tell a story of skulls with holes drilled in them for mounting, a grim accounting practice for a system that turned human heads into battlefield currency. The official chronicles omit the screams. They don't mention the smell. They erase the physiological terror. This is not a simple oversight. It is a deliberate campaign to erase the messy, agonizing human reality of their power. But the truth survives in the margins, in the private diaries of merchants, the letters of foreign diplomats, and now in the bones themselves. These hidden records tell a single, consistent story, not of honor, but of horrifying, systemic brutality. The evidence is overwhelming. The beautiful lie has been burned away, leaving only the blood-stained truth. The system was not about virtue, it was about fear. But this leads to the final haunting question. Was this system a monstrous anomaly of a bygone era? Or is this architecture of fear a timeless blueprint, one that reveals a darker, more universal truth about human nature and the intoxicating price of absolute power? The evidence is overwhelming. The beautiful lie has been burned away, leaving only the blood-stained truth. The system was not about honor, it was about fear. But this leads to the final, haunting question. Was this system a monstrous anomaly of a bygone era? Or is this architecture of fear a timeless blueprint, one that reveals a darker, more universal truth about human nature and the intoxicating price of absolute power? The answer, it seems, is that the specifics may be historical, but the blueprint is eternal. When you strip away the exotic armor and the unfamiliar names, the story of the samurai code becomes a case study in the mechanics of control. The serene art and noble philosophy of Bushidō served as the beautiful mask for the skull beneath. Every society, especially those built on a rigid hierarchy, requires a justification for its cruelties, a noble lie to make the unthinkable seem necessary. The punishments were never just punishments, they were public statements, a brutal form of communication. Seppuku was a tool to make the ruling class police themselves, forcing them to internalize the state's authority until it felt like personal honor. Crucifixion was a broadcast, a rotting billboard advertising the consequences of dissent. The saw was a diabolical ritual to ensure the public was not merely a passive audience, but a complicit participant in the state's terror. The samurai code, in the end, reveals a timeless truth. That power, when unchecked, will always seek to write its message on the bodies of the powerless. The methods may change, the blades and crosses replaced by more subtle instruments of control, but the impulse to make a spectacle of suffering to enforce the boundaries of the acceptable remains a dark constant in human history. So the final question we must ask ourselves is not just how they could do this then, in a world so different from our own. The real question, the one that should follow you long after the screen goes dark, is what architectures of fear do we live inside today? What are our noble lies, and whose suffering is the silent, unseen price of our own peace?